Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host, and as you can see, I have with me Lieutenant General Atta Hussain, who is one of the most articulate and one of the most decorated generals of the Indian Army who served in Kashmir. He was commander of Indian forces there, and after retirement, he has become a very important public intellectual who has contributed to various discussions on India's national security, India's military development, and international issues. And he is here with us again. He's been on the show before to talk about the two wars. We're going to review the two wars, where they are, where they stand, and where they are going. The Russian war with Ukraine and the Israeli Hamas war, Israeli Gaza war, you could now call the entire Middle East war. So welcome to Conversations, General Saab.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Jai Hind to all our viewers.
Thank you very much, sir. My first question to you is, sir, we are right now, in the past now 2 years, we are actually, the world has become quite insecure. If you notice, there are those wars which are, for the want of any better word, I want to use for the media, very sexy, which means that they cover the Russia-Ukraine war, they cover obviously the Israeli-Gaza war. In fact, since the Israeli onslaught began on Gaza and the horrible terrorist attacks of Hamas in October 7th, other parts of the world have faded, at least in the Western media's coverage. So no one talks about, say, the Sudan civil war, which has also completed 1 year yesterday, and the casualties there are also in the thousands. But do you, as a former military officer, see us living in a far more insecure world today than we did, say, 2 years ago? And how much of it is America's fault?
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to begin this conversation, I must say. Whenever this kind of a question, and this is a very good question put to me, whenever this kind of a question is put, my mind goes back to simply the whole process of this century, this particular century, and maybe 10 to 15 years before, in the earlier century, when we look at periods in which there have been intense military activity around the world, and then there have been breaks, there have been attempts to try and find a new world order, and that order has always remained somehow elusive. Now, this is something very similar. If you see the last 10 to 12 years, we had a very violent period from 2014 onwards when the ISIS came into being. If you remember, the Middle East was an absolute turbulence, very, very extreme kinds of violence which were prevailing there. There was Afghanistan which was taking place there. Kashmir in India was in its prime, in the sense that the issue was very, very live. Then, of course, by 2020, even the Sino-Indian border became very live. South China Sea was extremely turbulent. So there were periods. So I won't say it. What is happening at the moment is intense activity in restricted number of areas. And what's more important is that all that we saw in the last 10, 12 years was more in the domain of hybrid insurgencies, terror, counter-terrorism, and things like that. Suddenly, after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, these two wars which have emerged, one in Europe and the other in the Middle East, both tend to have a flavor of conventional operations, a return to conventional operations, which essentially in this case also means long conventional wars. We in India have been too used to short conventional wars. Our whole thought process has always been a quick war, a quick fix war in which there would be a black and white kind of a victory. These wars don't have those kind of victories. These will end in some kind of a situation of huge stalemates, which will fester for many years, perhaps absorbing a lot of energy of the entire world, but leading to really nothing. So, as to the question as to what is the American involvement in it, I mean, of course, America is the favorite whipping boy of everyone these days, but I don't blame the United States for everything. No. The US has tempered itself to a great extent in the sense that 21 years of fighting in Afghanistan, and a major decision was taken to withdraw from there, irrespective of what the outcomes would be. That was a bold step, bold but a step which was highly mismanaged. Before the United States could switch its focus towards the Indo-Pacific, which was actually the intent of getting out of Afghanistan, suddenly you found this pullback, one into Europe and one into the Middle East. The two otherwise very well known, zones of conflict. The zones of conflict in the world which everyone can identify are particularly Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South Asia to a great extent, Indo-Pacific, and to some extent with a potential in Central Asia. All those other regions at the moment are quiet. It is only these two which are extremely live. It seems sometimes as if some kind of a deliberate effort has been made to pull the United States back to Europe, pull it back to the Middle East, so that it cannot sort of focus its attention on the Indo-Pacific for the larger things to come, the confrontation with a not so friendly China in the future. These are the temptations one gets to think about. Not that they are all a reality as such.
Sir, yesterday I'm teaching an undergraduate class on American foreign policy this semester. So yesterday we were talking about grand strategies. And one of the things that came up in the discussion was that you're preparing for your entrance exam, which is like 3 or 4 months away, and now you're getting distracted by some quiz competitions here and there, and rather than focusing on preparing for the long-term exam, you are going for easy wins and say, oh, I won this trophy, I won that cup, I went to the YMCA quiz competition. So for the US, the real examination is the rise of China and how the US is going to make sure that China does not even dominate Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And these distractions in Ukraine, as you rightly pointed out, is indirectly helping China, make itself stronger in the region. And the US is spending resources, like the money is flowing like water. I mean, the Congress has stopped it, but another $100 billion is on the table this week. And the 3 countries that money is going to go to, $95 billion, is Ukraine, Russia, Israel, and Taiwan. So from that point of view, I think this is, but one of the things that America has not learned, whether it is in Vietnam, whether it was in Iraq, or whether it is in Afghanistan, that for some reason we are in a world where military, regardless of how much power you have, is incapable of shaping political outcomes. I mean, we didn't get the Iraq we wanted after spending $2 trillion. And Afghanistan looks exactly like it did in 1999. In fact, a more powerful Taliban. We left behind some $7 billion worth of weapons for them. So from that perspective, as a military person, do you think that the potency of military power to shape politics has diminished?
Well, yes, that's a very interesting observation which you are making. There's no doubt about it, that the capabilities of militaries around the world to actually finish conflicts, lead to conflict terminations and resolutions in favor of either side, has diminished to a very, very great extent. And that particular example is that of Afghanistan. We saw this in Iraq. It led to the rise of ISIS, for example, in Iraq. And Afghanistan, you saw what was a weak Taliban earlier emerge as a much stronger Taliban, something to which no country is going to try and enter into Afghanistan, perhaps for the next 50 to 100 years. And similarly, what is happening at the moment in the Middle East, in the sense of a response which Israel thinks it can ultimately resolve this issue with a military response, so to say, has led to nothing. And similarly, the Russian entire strategy against Ukraine and the pushback from Ukraine with the entire support of NATO has led to almost nothing. So you're absolutely 100% right. I think we are going back into the period of long wars. We saw what happened in the Second World War, what's happened in the First World War. Events played themselves out. Nations ultimately came down to their knees economically, the incapability to fight beyond a certain point. Scientific research perhaps led to the domination of one side over the others. That is exactly what is almost being repeated today. Something which happened 120 years ago is exactly what is happening almost today. So you're right. The ability, the stamina will have to, I mean, everyone is there for a quick fix kind of a solution at the moment. I'm sure when Israel decided to go into Gaza out of a very frustrated kind of a strategy which it adopted, it knew for certain that it would not be able to terminate this conflict in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks. It's now 6 months and over, beyond that. And I don't think this is going to terminate in a hurry anytime in the future. Neither is the Ukraine-Russian conflict either going to terminate. So we are going to see festering conflicts around the world which will continue, but political leaderships are wont to ever try and sort of engage each other without some kind of a military, not a victory, should I say, some kind of a military success having been established. And that seems to be elusive everywhere at the moment.
Yes, that is quite remarkable. Countries seeking to enforce their will on other people by force and then watching other countries fail. I mean, if the richest country and the most powerful country in the world, the US, could not force its will on the poorest country in the world, Afghanistan. I mean, the mismatch is, you can't get a worse mismatch. It's maybe US going after Maldives. It could be even worse. Exactly. And I find it perplexing that politicians are not grasping this failures and what it means politically, and even the generals are not conveying that. What I was involved in the Philippines peace process a few years ago, and I was horrified to learn that the people who were involved in actual fighting, the military people, they got promotions much faster than people who were not. And so to me, I suddenly realized that there were lots of other incentives for not having peace. So
a lot of people accuse us in India of that, but ours is quite a different situation here.
So
we have tried military means in India, and we have succeeded to a great extent in terms of different types of conflicts, diverse conflicts,
India's
the hybrid variety.
I think India's military strategy was to basically stop the bleeding, do the counterinsurgency, stop. So, for example, the US has been successful to some extent with the global war on terror. The US feels safe now. But so militarily, that has been successful, the counter-terrorism strike. And so has India been successful, but that doesn't mean that India has imposed its will on its enemies or either side of the war.
But let me assure you, Dr. Khan, while the United States today should definitely be proud of the fact that the first cycle of global terror has almost ended completely, almost 4 or 5 years ago, we are coming into a second cycle, which seems to be very imminent. With what's happened in Moscow, what's happening in Pakistan,
even Iran.
Iran, absolutely.
ISIS, and I find that because, see, there are two things, like if I get a flare up here, the first thing the doctors need to do is deal with the immediate symptom and then go after the cause of the symptom. What the US has done has addressed the symptoms, but not really gone out of the core causes, the reason why there is so much
revival is always possible.
Yes, and because there is so much of demonization, when we talk about terrorism, one of the things I remind my students is that the US Congress voted Nelson Mandela as a terrorist, and now we celebrate him as a great,
as a Gandhian, virtually.
Like a Gandhian, exactly. So all of this moral rhetoric has to some extent also prevented countries from addressing the core causes which cause resentment, etc. I wanted to get your views on what you think was Iran's goal. I mean, yes, it was retaliating for the attack on its embassy in Syria, but the manner in which it conducted its attack, what are your views on it?
Firstly, I mean, let's start with the with the trigger. That's the first April attack which the Israelis executed against the consulate in Damascus. And I wrote about it and I mentioned this fact that from time to time, Israel will always target the area of the Levant because they do not want the proxies, they do not want the IRGC leadership to establish itself completely there, because that will become a virtual continuum of Iranian territory and allow the Iranians a completely free hand to be able to utilize this territory as they wish. And that's one of the reasons why the Israelis keep doing this, and they've got the very intense intelligence focus on this area, and they know every moment, every movement of the IRGC leadership which steps into these areas, and they make sure that they target it or they target whatever resources that they bring to battle there. So the 1st of April strike was with this concept in mind. Iran cannot remain silent, to my mind, cannot remain silent. First of all, the reason for it is that Iran has chosen a very muscular kind of a policy against Israel. A lot of rhetoric. And if that rhetoric is not backed by action at a time when it is perhaps needed, or at least is demonstrated, all that rhetoric is for nothing. It's waste. And much of the effects of that in social media or influencing operations, etc., is going to get wasted. So Iran has to do something. The strategy which Iran has followed against Israel all these years, probably surely for the lack of the fact that there is no common border between the two, is to use proxies. These are the Hezbollah and the Syrian army, as you're aware, in Lebanon and in Syria. They use the Hamas in Gaza, and they've used the Houthis in South Yemen. And each have got their role, and they've done it fairly successfully to an extent, frustratingly for many others. That frustration for others is an apparent success for Iran. So in this situation, Iran couldn't be seen to be just sitting quietly. If we remember, we take our minds back to the 8th of January 2020. As a response to what had happened in terms of the assassination of Soleimani, of Brigadier General Soleimani at that time, what did the Iranians do? They fired 12 missiles at a American airbase in western Iraq. Symbolic. It was just a firing, a symbolic, no casualties, no destruction of equipment, etc., and the matter just fizzled out. That's exactly what Iran was perhaps looking for here. Iran is not in a position to go to war. Definitely its sponsors, the Russia and China, would not want Iran to be embroiled in conflict at this particular time. It is not in their interest. But Iran has to continue to show that it exists and it backs the Palestinian cause much more vehemently than what the entire combination of Arabs can ever do. So it's with this purpose that the Iranians chose to carry out an attack. Now, it's the nature of attack which is important to understand. All kinds of analyses are going around on the internet at the moment, and what I found, one of them, a plausible one, was to fire all these munitions in a continuum over a period of time, giving Israel enough time and giving its allies enough time to be able to intercept. As we see, the Jordanians, the Saudis, everyone has joined in the intercept game. The intent seems to have been to warn them, and that's why slow-moving, drones were used in the beginning, so that everyone would get alerted and they could be shot down comfortably. The other, not so modern missiles, and I would like our viewers to know that missilery and rocketry is something that the Iranians have been acquiring since 1991-92. From North Korea, the Nordong missile at that particular time, I think it was a rocket or a missile, I can't really recall, and from China, from Russia. So there have been a huge consignment of missilery which has existed with Iran. They did not want to probably use the modern ones. They just wanted to use the crude, slightly older versions to allow them to be virtually sacrificed and force the Israelis to fire all their modern rocketry in terms of what exists for the Iron Dome at the moment. So it's a mismatch. Actually, if you really see, it's a huge mismatch. Fighting a 200, 300 of these crude ancient machines and attracting a tremendous amount of modern rocketry as far as the Israelis are concerned. So this seems to be a demonstration, a message that they have the capability, they can take this beyond if they wish to, but that they do not want to see this escalation taking place beyond.
Yes, I mean, Iran surprisingly is also, according to some intelligence sources, in possession of even hypersonic missiles, and it has a significant array. And I mean, those drones were traveling at 140 kilometers per hour. It took 9 hours to get to the target. I mean, I drive my car faster than that. There are some fast bowlers in India who bowl faster than those rockets. But what was also interesting is I was listening to a British general, and he was saying that this is standard tactics. You throw your inexpensive gear at them, but what you do is you saturate the whole thing, and as a result of that, your entire defense is engaged. So you're right. You're using a $1 million missile against a $20,000 drone, and then suddenly you slip in the real potent weapons. Like I remember reading a military doctrine that if there was a USSR attack, they would launch 1,000 missiles, but only 10 or 20 would carry nukes, and that you will have to guess which one to block because which is. So that is the tactic that Iran has used. But I think the most significant aspect is what this so-called unprecedented Iran to Israel direct attack that has taken place. And I think the fact that Israel needed US, UK, France, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia also to join in to protect itself from basement stuff from Iran shows that Israel perhaps is overrated as a major superpower, perhaps. And the second thing is, while Israel can defend itself, I think this should scare the hell out of the Arab countries which are hostile towards Iran, because France, Britain, and US are not going to jump to the aid of other Arab countries if Iran were to send 300 drones at them, right? So it kind of raises the fear component of the Arab nations, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this observation is absolutely correct. Every action that Iran takes, it takes with the intent of sending a message. Influence operations, so to say, psychological operations, something which can affect the mind, convey to them that this is our actual capability, we can go far beyond that. That is the kind of message which they are trying to send in this environment. As far as Israel is concerned, itself, the military leadership in Israel should be concerned about this. The fact that 7th of October happened at all, fact that there was a huge intelligence failure which took place, and now that because of the various operations, etc., the message should have been clearer that Israel is capable of defending itself. Israel is capable of taking the war far beyond to other nations who try and interfere in their affairs. That seems to have diluted completely with this particular action. And if the next question, which inevitably will come up in our discussion, what will Israel at all retaliate for this? Yeah. Is Netanyahu in a position to be able to retaliate for this? Militarily, even before you ask me that question, let me slip in this little comment to say it doesn't make very good sense when you're fighting on one front to open up another front. Israel is badly stuck in Gaza at the moment. And they're looking at all the other options of going further south and things like that. In the middle of all this, you have a very, very active Hezbollah, a very active proxy front opening up in on the northern borders and against Lebanon and Syria. It doesn't make any military sense at all. So really saying Israel is stuck at the moment. Completely not many options available to it.
Israel also has the US in trouble. See, for example, if they do escalate the war, and I mean, the danger is for Iran that they might hit their nuclear facilities or hit some of their major assets, like a harbor. I mean, imagine they take out a very important trading port or something like that. So, and one thing that is apparent is that Iran, I think, is an offensive capabilities are much, much more pronounced than its defensive capabilities. So, for example, if you're building a base, a military kind of installation in the Syrian, in Damascus, and there was no air defense system there. So, I would have done that first before I put in other assets, including generals right there, right? So, I think Iran is so focused on offensive capabilities to deter that its defensive capabilities willing to take these attacks, especially if thinking that the nuclear facilities are deeply buried. But to me, I feel that if there is an escalation of the war, uh, if another 20, 30 Israelis die right now, apparently the Israeli population is in a warlike mode because of October 7. Israel might survive that. But if, God forbid, accidentally or through some freak luck, an American boat or ship or base is hit and 20, 30 Americans die, that's the end of Biden. he,
Yes,
he's finished.
that is a fear. That is the fear, and is a inevitable return of Trump.
Yes.
Whatever things are the way things are at the moment, and I tend to agree with your surmise and this observation that Iran does not tend to think too much defensively. It's the manner in which all this leadership of the IRGC has been roaming around all over the Middle East. That is what led to Soleimani's assassination, if you remember.
Yeah.
And a very apt observation on your part that with the IRGC leadership sitting, part of the leadership sitting in Damascus itself, no protection, nothing itself. But this is one area where I would give a lot of brownie points to the Israelis. Their intelligence, as far as this area is concerned, seems to be completely in focus. They seem to have got their act together in terms of precision areas where important assets exist and things like that. I will not be surprised that they know every single inch. They have mapped probably every single inch of all the nuclear assets that exist on Iranian soil, and they could possibly go ahead and take those out. But for that they will need an express approval of the United States of America, because I don't think the US would want this kind of a thing to escalate to that level.
I mean,
that really is a very high escalation.
The president has already said that the US is not going to participate with Israel. I mean, for the last 10 years, there have been this constant discussion about attacking Iranian nuclear facilities. And all military analysis has said that Israel can't do this on its own, even if the Saudis allow airspace and refueling both. If the Saudis allow both, even then Iran may not be able to achieve that. And so they need the US for that kind of an attack. And I think Biden is still very upset, because if you remember, after the April 1st attack, Americans went to great lengths to say we were not involved, we were not informed, and we did not give the green signal, basically telling the Iranians, do not retaliate against our assets, which are sitting there. The US has about 2,000 troops in the area who are quite vulnerable to a massive attack like this. So let's take a look at the other war, and it appears that Russia is once again a bit more successful in its military activities in Ukraine. And I was listening to or reading General Petraeus. He provides like a daily update on LinkedIn about the war, and he was saying that not only the fact that new supplies are not coming because of the money from the US has at the moment dried up, but also apparently the Russians' learning curve is finally working, and they seem to have much better tactics, so much better use. And so they have succeeded to a great extent to damage the energy sector in Ukraine, etc. How do you see that war unfolding? Is there any chances that there could be some kind of ending in this year?
Well, reports on this war are not very reliable. At the beginning of the war itself, both sides adopted a media policy, some kind of a social media and psychological operations policy, etc. The kind of reports emanating from Washington, from the United States of America, were such as if the war is going to end tomorrow, virtually the annihilation of the Russian campaign there and things like that. And the Russian media was completely sort of subsumed as a part of this entire thing. Later, we started getting more reports from Russia, and the reality started emerging. Initially, we also saw how much of a hero Zelensky was made out to be, heroics of the Ukrainian armed forces, etc. We have seen a much quieter version of that in the last couple of months. So obviously, things are done. I mean, in the sense, both sides are holding back at the moment. It's very clear that the world is unprepared for conventional wars. For far too long now, in the last 30, 40 years, nations have actually toyed with each other through the hybrid means of, terrorist attacks and psychological warfare and things of that nature. Suddenly to come into engagement on a typical conventional warfare front, nothing seems to be coming out of it. And that is why I don't expect when now the winter is over, and by now, if there had to be a serious offensive, the Russians would perhaps be prepared for it or preparing for it. So something could happen over the next 4 to 6 weeks if that has to culminate before the next winter, right? It will take the better part of 8 to 10, 12 weeks before anything positive really emerges on the battlefield itself. Given the fact that the Ukrainians in defense, offensively, the Ukrainian capability has downgraded completely, but defensively, the Ukrainians are still very much there. In defensive means, you don't require perhaps so much of ammunition and so much of wherewithal, but for offensive, that much is required, and that therefore offensives are counter-offensives of the type which took place in the last 2 cycles of offensive operations will probably not come from the Ukrainian side in the near future. So what we can see is a stalemate. And if anyone has any offerings of a ceasefire and potential negotiations, etc., it will ultimately come down to the fronts resting somewhere on the river, Dnieper, somewhere the Donetsk area will be completely will perhaps remain with the Russians, and they will want to make sure that the Russian-dominated areas are all within their control, properly defended to make sure that there's no potential counteroffensive which can sort of upscale them from there. So that kind of an activity will continue through this year. I don't expect anyone to come to the negotiating table, particularly the fact that there is an election on in the United States. Biden himself would not want to be seen very negatively, in the sense that not being able to support Ukraine to a final end, that is something which is not going to be a very positive kind of a development for the Biden administration. So I don't think too much is going to happen. There may be some last-ditch efforts towards August, September, October, when the election scene really hots up in the United States. But besides that, I don't expect anything much to happen.
Yeah, and also the money is critical, because I don't think that the Europeans, in spite of all their talk, are going to be able to step up and compensate for the $60 billion that the US is promising Ukraine. And I think that if this particular Congress successfully separates Ukraine aid and Israeli aid, and if the Israeli aid passes, then I don't think there's any chance of the Ukraine bill passing. So as long as the Senate holds on to both together, that's what the Democrats are doing. Because the Democrats are also under pressure that, okay, we are using aid to Israel as a hostage. And so there's a price to be paid for that also, right? Like for the sake of Ukraine, you are leaving Israel, in need.
Right.
Yeah, basically that is what is happening. And so, which means that the administration has already realized that there isn't support for Ukraine on its own now. I don't think a bill of 50, 60 billion to Ukraine on its own is not going to fly through the Constitution.
I don't know whether the European theater, I mean the NATO itself, is capable of raising anything much more than what
Yeah,
it has already done.
yeah. See, the thing is that they're in quite a disarray. I mean, I was reading that Macron has been making these noises that he's willing to send troops on the ground, and it turns out that Macron is the biggest buyer of Russian oil this year. In 2024, he's been importing close to $1 billion worth of Russian energy. So I'm not very sure whether these countries are capable of. I mean, their economies are so fragile, 0.4% growth rate, UK is in recession, etc. My last question, sir, to you, I see that you give a lot of strategic presentations. If you were invited by the Ministry of Defense to give like 2 or 3 points of what lessons can India draw from these two wars, like what would they be?
Yes, interesting aspect. We are in a situation where our two fronts are still very active. The northern front against China and our western front. Uh, Irrespective of what the situation which exists today, the lessons we should cater for here is to remember that, for one, India cannot think of short wars. You see a 2 week war or a 3 week war with international pressure building up and then everything coming to a stop, to a halt. I think that is something of the past. We have to be prepared for the long haul. And if it is a two-front war which takes place, in which the stakes for both China and Pakistan are high in terms of mutual support and supporting each other, India should be really prepared for the long haul. No one is going to call for ceasefires very early. The world may call for ceasefires early, but I don't think this could be executed very early on the ground. And therefore, India has to be prepared for that. Second thing, India has to cater for its energy, it has to cater for its ammunition, it has to cater for its logistics. Far too much time, too many times, we cater for everything in terms of human resources, weaponry, etc. But the sustainability of all this is something that is always questionable. So a couple of years ago, we were absolutely down and out as far as ammunition is concerned. Our ammunition planning was in complete disarray. Today, fortunately, we have recovered to a very great extent. So a lot of attention on logistics. The ongoing transformation which is taking place in the Indian Armed Forces has to be supported by total self-reliance. Because you're seeing in this Ukraine situation, for example, Ukraine is down and out. Unless it gets weaponry, it can't fight. And the Russians may be able to subjugate Ukraine ultimately for the simple reason that the Ukrainians have nothing to fight with.
Yeah.
Now, that kind of a situation should never emerge in the Indian front, and our Atmanirbharta or our self-reliance mode that we have adopted must be given even greater impetus than what it has received so far. And the last part, the last one, to be prepared for the imponderables. Let's not think that Pakistan is extremely weak today. Its economy is down and out, and that it cannot sponsor a revival of whatever happened in between India and Pakistan in the last 30-35 years. That revival could always take place. Ideological revivals, revivals of hybrid conditions, all this could always revive, and therefore we should be mentally prepared for it, and we should not stop looking at changing things around. I think the next 4 or 5 years are very crucial, particularly in a state like Jammu and Kashmir, where we have, I think, achieved a tremendous amount, but we need to make sure that that stabilization remains in place for a longer period of time.
The Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, they come up with the annual who is exporting and who is buying weapons. One of the things that is very striking is that India is now the biggest importer of weapons worldwide. India is like 11 or 13% of all global weapons that are sold are coming to India. And China is not. And even though it spends a lot more than India, nearly 3 to 4 times India's defense budget is China's defense budget. So it is very clear that alone suggests that China is more Atmanirbhar than India is at this moment, because India is importing. And I think that, all Sun Tzu used to say that anybody who needs to fight with mercenaries is ultimately going to lose, no matter how much money you have. If you need to fight for your own
Yourself.
country, or so I think that perhaps one of the long term goals of India, besides being Atmanirbhar in the sense, is stockpiling. I think given that the nature of hopefully diplomacy can offset the need for conflict. So General Saab, thank you very much for being with us, and I'm extremely grateful to you for joining us, and thank you everybody for watching Khanversations. And if you have not subscribed to Khanversations, please subscribe to Khanversation, like this video and share it with others. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Muqtedar Khan. I really enjoyed this. It was a generic discussion, and that's what made it even more important. The specifics were there, but we, I think, went around the Middle East into Europe and portions of South Asia, etc., and drew perhaps a lot of conclusions from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.